me turn that off.
Oh, that was me. Okay. But it's not. It's fine.
Okay. So everyone can hear us now. Okay. Hey, Andrew, that does work. So looks good.
Great.
And I think we have people rapidly joining. So we'll just get started in maybe a minute or so. Thank you, everyone, for joining. Hey, Chris, let me turn the video off.
Our videos actually just. Try to share yours. You're going to share something too, right? Let's test yours.
It should be going. Here. Great, we've got tons of people joining. We'll give it maybe one or two more minutes. Thank you, everyone. I'm assuming they can hear me, right? Okay. Can you see my screen?
You can see Jennifer's screen there, right, Brandon?
I see the
Yep. Yes, my coworker can see your slide, Jennifer.
Okay, great. Works for me. Thank you. So I think we had about 400 and something people register for this, and I see about 80, oh my gosh, 120 people are on now, so that's nice. Thank you, everyone, so much for joining. We might give it 30 more seconds just for a couple hundred more people to join, and then we'll get started. Thank you.
Try to share yours again.
I'm sharing right now. Started in like 30 seconds. Thank you. All right, awesome. We still have maybe 30 more seconds as the last couple hundred people join the call. Thank you, everyone, so much for joining this webinar. I'm really glad you're here. I'm really happy we're able to connect with you all. All right, so let's get started. As a few just housekeeping notes, you have joined a free webinar about the Transparency and Consent Framework hosted by IAB Tech Lab. We will record the event, we're currently recording, and we will also share the deck. So if that's your question, there's the answer. Speaking of questions, Blue Jeans has a question and answers function. Everyone should have the opportunity to be able to ask their questions. If you post those, I will try to answer them. I think my friend Andrew Allen might be able to help answer some of those written questions as well. But we'll have a time specifically for question and answers towards the latter half of our call. So we'll go through our slide deck now, as I think we've given enough time for everyone to join. So yes, recorded. Yes, we'll share the slides. All right. Okay, so welcome to the webinar. I'm Jennifer Durkee. I'm a product director at IAB Tech Lab. I've been working on the IAB Tech Lab's technical work on the IAB Europe Transparency and Consent Framework. Also presenting today is Andrew Allen, software engineer at QuantCast, and they'll be providing a CMP demo for us as well. So a few notes about the technical working group working on compliance with GDPR. So Tech Lab itself does global digital standards, specifications, and tools. This includes things like the OpenRTB protocol, or VAST, or the new ad portfolio, or Lean. We have always been globally focused, and so work on international legislation and providing technical standards obviously fits our mission. The GDPR Technical Working Group stewards the technical specifications for IAB Europe's Transparency and Consent Framework. And we're going to explain what this Transparency and Consent Framework is, and then really discuss the implementation aspects of it. We are now, 8 days away from May 25, which hopefully you're all aware of the date of enforcement for GDPR. We are just going to hop right into content. And presuming that you all are aware of the GDPR itself, but obviously it's a European law aiming to provide consumers in Europe with expanded privacy. There's plenty of content online at the IAB Tech Lab site. We link to IAB Europe's presentations on policy. So for the technical specifications of the framework, we do have the final versions of 1.1 specs published. That includes the consent management provider JavaScript API specs, and it also includes the global vendor list and consent string specs. We published those a couple of weeks ago. I know that many companies have already started implementing and are in either finished or are very close to finishing their implementations in order to comply by May 25. The global vendor list, and we'll describe what that is a little bit further, but we have at least 200 vendors who have registered to the global vendor list. And that shows an incredible amount of very quick and broad sweeping adoption of this framework with those vendors participating. We also have publishers, buyers, other ad tech vendors or data companies or consent management providers adopting. There are implementation guidelines that can act as a resource for you all. And then also, and this is in the top row here, but we have two specifications out for public comment. So we're already looking towards the future with this framework. Pubvendors.json is out for public comment until June 1, and the mobile in-app spec is out for public comment until June 1 as well. And I think we have some early adopters on those technologies as well. We will dive into what those are, what they mean, and how they work later in this presentation. So we'll talk about what the framework is. We'll talk about what consent strings CMPs are and the global vendor list. We will talk about how publishers can implement. We'll talk about how buyers and vendors can read consent strings, and then we'll talk. Then we'll have a CMP demo, and then we'll also be talking about the specifications that are in public comment and how to implement. Then we will have time for panel Q&A, and you can ask us, or I think there are some other leaders on the call as well, and so we might tap them to help answer some of the questions as well. Another moment to level set as well. If you need to multitask during this call, please let it be with these two websites. iabtechlab.com/GDPR-tech will redirect you to the GitHub repository, which has all of the specs, implementation guidelines, and specs for public comment. Advertisingconsent.eu has policy FAQ and policy requirements for the framework. Speaking of advertisingconsent.eu, I want to be very explicit with where you can find the resources. This is a critical component. Vendors and CMPs should be registering. The place to do this is on the advertisingconsent.eu website. IAB Europe runs this. There's global vendor list registration, CMP registration, and here is the link to the policies. All of this is available to you guys as well. Advertisingconsent.eu. So what is the underlying tech in the framework? Assuming some baseline knowledge from you all here, but we'll cover some of the foundation details. So a CMP is a consent management provider. That's the party that can read the vendors chosen by the publisher and the consent status of that end user. So this can either be service specific, using first-party cookies to store consent information, or global or web-wide through a third-party cookie. So both of these are supported by the framework, and CMPs can function in either way. The DAISY bit is information that is compressed in a binary value and passed throughout the advertising ecosystem through the OpenRTB certification. The compressed information is also referred to as the consent string. The global vendor list is those registered vendors who are third parties that a publisher might be using in connection with surfacing content to its end users that either access an end user's device or browser and or collects or receives personal data about the publisher's end users. So CMPs, consent strings, and global vendor list. The global vendor list is available at the vendorlist.consency.org /vendorlist.json. This is an excerpt from the spec, so if you can't read this text, go read the spec. The purposes are standardized and listed in this file. The features are standardized and listed in this file. Each of the purposes and each of the features have IDs associated with them so that we can all talk about them in the same standardized way. And then the other component of the global vendor list is obviously the list of vendors. And each vendor, as they register, will then have an ID associated with them. The vendor claims which purposes require consent and which purposes that vendor is claiming legitimate interest as the legal basis for, and then also declares their features as a vendor. There's also a link for the policy URL. This global vendor list is live, so if you wanted to see all of the hundreds of vendors who registered, that's where it is. This is also listed in the specifications. This is a slide that I can come back to if we need for reference. This slide is from IAB Europe, which is a helpful way to help us understand what happens when consent information is generated and how does the supply chain respond to that information in the consent string. So if we have a list of vendors who have been asked for surfaced as part of the consent tool to a user, and then that user says yes, no to each of those vendors, we then have that consent string of information telling us which vendors have consent and which are able to be using personal targeting information. So, for example, we would follow this chain of green here for all of the vendors that do have consent to serve an ad based on the consumer's consent preferences. We can come back to this for reference if anyone has further questions. We've also mentioned the OpenRTB specification. So there are fields. This is a link. You guys can all reference this in the docs that we'll send out as well, or this slide itself that we'll send out. So the OpenRTB advisory recommends the use of two fields, regs.extension.gdpr, user.extension.consent. This communicates if GDPR applies, and then it also communicates the consent string itself. The consent string itself should refer to the consent string as specified in the framework. So the advisory document has this detail, and it also has the details for what we expect for OpenRTB version 3. So it won't be an extension, it'll just be included in the future specifications. We also mentioned here that the consent string will be part of the authenticated supply, so that's the ads.cert or signed bid requests. And there's more reading material about that on the Tech Lab website, and if you guys have questions about that, we can also discuss consent as part of authenticated supply or part of that signed bid request message, which provides security so that we know that the inventory has not been tampered with. So those are some of the fundamental technologies in the framework itself. I'm happy to revisit any of those items. We're assuming some baseline knowledge from you all. So let's have a CMP demo, see how this comes to life for what a consumer would see and how some of those functionalities work for publishers. And then we'll talk about how these things are implemented. So if you want to build a CMP, what do you need to do? And if you're a publisher, what do you need to do? And if you're a vendor or buyer, how are you implementing? And then we'll talk about future tech, and then we'll answer your questions. So Andrew Allen, I'll pass the microphone and the screen share to you. Attendees, give us a moment while we transition, and I think there it goes. So I see your screen, and I think we're good to go.
All right. My name's Andrew Allen, like Jennifer said. I'm a software engineer at Quantcast, and we are developing our own consent manager called Quantcast Choice, and it's ready for use. If you're interested in using it, we have a link to Quantcast Choice down at the bottom of quantcast.com. This is a demo page that we've put up that shows. At the first experience, the back of the web page would be your web content, and then the first time the user visits, there is this consent dialog that pops up. It is modal, so it blocks everything on the page until the user is able to make some choices. To make it simple, the main two buttons are basically a big I accept and I do not accept buttons. If the user wants to go in and see what various purposes are being consented to, we list the publisher purposes up here at the top, and those can be turned on or off. And then there's also the third-party vendor purposes that are part of the global vendor cookie. So I could go ahead and enable all those purposes if I wanted to. And the other thing that we enable is to be able to see the full vendor list. Again, you're able to turn all those on and turn all those off. Right now, there's the roughly 200 vendors on this list. We do support the in-comment pubvendors.json file right now for publishers that want to limit this vendor list down to a specific number of people, down to a smaller list of people that they do business with. Sort of the drawback to that is bidders and inventory that aren't consented to, you'll sort of lose out on the advertising revenue. So it's much better to sort of make your whitelist as expansive as possible, so that you're getting the most amount of the largest number of bidders, and that they're able to place the largest number of impressions. There's also third-party vendors that are going to request consent for doing things like viewability and click tracking. If we save and exit, the way this is working in the background is this calls a JavaScript callback that's located on the web that's located on this main page, and that's able to query the list of vendors and the list of both publisher purposes and vendor purposes that were selected. So if we go in and take a couple of, I decide I don't like those first two vendors, and maybe I want to turn off ad selection. No, let's turn off personalization for the vendor selection. When we update those, we can see that the first two vendors are turned off. And since we turned off personalization, it also turned off a few vendors that were requested the personalization purpose. We're still sort of experimenting with like the right UI, whether it's best to sort of like automatically select and deselect the vendors based on which purposes they're claiming, or whether to make the lists more independent. So we're trying to sort of figure out the best balance of that. And let's see, for publishers that want to integrate this, we have put up a Get Quantcast choice page, and what this is the tag that publishers need to put on their page is a little bit involved and requires some customization. So you can go ahead and enter the name of your publishing company and a logo that will be shown on the CMP, how many days you want to go between asking for consent from users, which purposes you want to do. We also support a redirect URL. Like Jennifer mentioned, you can do global consent scope, service consent scope. We also have these group consent scopes, which support groups of publishers using a shared third-party cookie, but not the global vendor cookie to store their consents. Right now, we support a small number of languages. We're looking to expand that further. And then we also allow a bunch of other customizations on the UI, including button colors. We have a pop-up layout and a bottom tray modal that looks much more like a consent banner, sort of what we're calling that. Customizing your copy, this is actually being restricted down to sort of like a more limited set of legally approved copies so that publishers won't just be able to put anything up there. Several options, several more customizations, and then a little bit of information about you so that we can know who you are and how you're using our consent manager. The Get Code button then just basically generates some boilerplate tag for you that will go ahead and install the CMP on your page, and also put up some. If I had done any style customizations, we'd also give you some CSS rule overrides for that. That's pretty much for the demo. If there's, did you want me to cover anything else, Jennifer?
No, but let's maybe take a moment if there were questions that came through. We had a question that come through during your demo. Is vendor personalization a standard list or defined by Quantcast?
The vendor list personalization is basically a list of vendors that is totally up to the publisher to choose and pick. So it's pretty much any of the vendors from the global vendor list can be subsetted.
And then if another question came through, if we use the Quantcast CMP widget, where will the data be stored? With Quantcast, do they get to use it?
No, basically the consent information as defined in the spec is stored either in a browser, either the third-party global cookie on consensu.org or in a browser first-party cookie. The only thing Quantcast really logs is an audit log of what consent storage was needed, sort of in case that's needed for sort of legal auditing later. But unless Quantcast gets consent and does sort of bidding, or you already have our measure tag on your site, we don't use any of the other information except basically for auditing purposes.
And then there's a question along those lines as well. How do you get support for the vendor personalization for the code? And does the edited code need to be approved by Quantcast?
No. How that works is, I think it's not a configuration option that's on there right now. We do have a sort of a technical implementation guide. I believe you basically just configure the CMP to point to a pubvendors.json file. And if you format that JSON file according to the spec that's out for review right now, the Quantcast choice CMP will show only that list of vendors.
Okay, thanks. A few more questions came through as well. So I'll just rapid fire them to you, Andrew. Thank you.
Sure.
Can the user close out the window without accepting or rejecting?
No, that's currently not a feature. The reason is because like sort of from our reading of the GDPR spec, is the user needs to make an affirmative yes or no choice, and so we currently don't have an option for being able to close the UI without making a choice. If we did, that would have to be treated the same as no consent anyway. So we sort of think that giving the user an explicit no button is a much more clear signal for that.
Okay. Is there a limit of number of vendors?
No, we will support all of the vendors on the global vendor list if that's what the publisher wants, or a limited list of vendors specified in pubvendors.
Will you support an extended list of vendors that a publisher would provide?
We don't have the ability today to be able to extend it with sort of additional vendors not on the vendor list. That along with custom purposes are probably up on our top two requested list of features. We're probably going to support custom purposes first. You can kind of wedge in additional vendor support that way. As far as actually supporting additional vendors on the vendor list, it's not really clear where to put that, so we may just sort of fold that into the support for custom publisher purposes as well, because there's not much else of a place to put that data.
So I think one of the takeaways from your answer that I got there was that yes, there is the flexibility to allow for that extensibility.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you.
All right.
More questions. Thank you everyone for asking these questions, and thanks for your patience. I'm trying to go in order, so we'll hopefully get to them all. Does QuantCast CMP support mobile apps? I'll talk to this for a quick second, that we'll be talking about mobile apps spec towards the end of our call. So Andrew, if you want to answer specifically to QuantCast, and then we can talk further about the mobile app CMP plan later in this call.
We haven't specifically built in support for mobile apps yet, although you may be able to get it working sort of like through a mobile app web view. That would be a very interesting experiment, but we're not but we haven't currently made it work.
There are a couple dozen CMPs, and I think there are a few who have been early adopters of the mobile app spec. So we can talk about that a little bit more further on too. That'd probably be something really good for the CMP vendors who are listed on advertisingconsent.eu, for them to be able to sort of indicate, like sort of features that they support, if they support customized purposes, if they support mobile app, things like that. Wouldn't it, Jennifer? Yeah, good idea.
Yeah.
There was a question of, have the EU regulators of other governing bodies weighed in on if this approach is acceptable? So we're doing a technical implementation call right now, and Andrew and I neither of us are lawyers, not able to, provide guidance on how to comply with GDPR. As far as answering that question, it's hard for us to give a positive answer, or a authoritative answer, excuse me. But I do know that conversations with EU regulators and DEPAs have happened, and in a positive direction, as there are many of us who have now implemented this.
We've certainly tried our hardest to like sort of comply with both the IAB Europe's policies and what we understand the GDPR policies to be. I think that's the short answer. but it is sort of up to each of the companies to sort of make their own legal determination on the applicability of this consent as well.
Yeah. We've got a great question here. Is the consent collected on behalf of the publisher or on behalf of the vendors, or both?
That is definitely a both. Publishers can basically specify any of the 5 standard purposes that they want to collect consent for, and then they are also collecting consent on behalf of their vendors, and that's passed on through the consent string.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, there's a lot of questions coming in. What I think I'm going to do is do a little bit more of presentation from us, so that we can talk about some of these things, and then hopefully answer some of the questions that you guys are posting, and then we'll come back. So I think the last question that I have that is super applicable to this demo is, how are the vendors ordered? Does the publisher decide this?
Right now, they're just ordered as they appear in the global vendor list. Definitely one of the features that we are going to be adding in the next couple of days is the ability to sort them alphabetically. We haven't gotten the feature request for publisher specified ordering, but that's not a bad idea either. So we'll certainly take that under advisement.
One other question came through that's super relevant to how CMPs look. How would a user revoke or change their consent status?
So the revocation, if they want it to be global, is pretty much clicking on I do not consent, and publishers should always provide some sort of change consent link or button on their website that will bring up the CMP at any time. And so from here, basically all choices are again possible. So it's pretty much change consent, I do not consent, and that's how a consumer can revoke their consent.
Cool. Thanks, Andrew. So I see at least a dozen more questions, but I'm going to pause. The last question I just answered, the next one is there some implementation guidelines for SSPs? So let's talk about implementation guidelines, and then we'll answer these questions. Keep them coming, and if we don't answer every question, we can always send out a follow-up doc to answer all these questions. So thank you all, and thank you so much, Andrew Allen, for that awesome demo. Very helpful for us. All right, so how do you implement? I will also, on the tails of the CMP demo, I will also point out that on advertisingconsent.eu, where someone would register to be on the global vendor list, you can also register to be a CMP, and then there's also a list of registered CMPs. So the IAB is not necessarily endorsing one or the other. There are plenty of CMPs to choose from, and publishers also have the flexibility to create their own CMP as well, and we'll talk about that. How can I implement as a CMP? So the function of a CMP is to collect the consent from the end user in a way that is compliant with the IAB Europe recommendations and guidelines. You'll generate an encoded list of purposes and consents by vendor from the GDPR consent information collected from the user. Then the next step would be to share that DAISY bit with vendors through the following APIs. So all that information that was collected from that interface that Andrew was showing us then gets shared in these following ways. Websites can implement the consent management provider JavaScript API specification so that vendors are able to ping that API to check for consent. URL-based services and emails can implement the CMP API for URL-based services. And if folks have questions on that, Andrew is the perfect person to help answer those questions. And then mobile app support, and we'll talk about that more in depth as well. And then the CMP would store consent. Consent can be stored using cookies, and it can be using first-party cookies or third-party cookies. So I know there's questions coming in about ITP and Safari. Well, if third-party cookies don't have a long life in Safari, guess what? We can still use first-party cookies. So we might be finding ways to be even more effective there, but the first response, I think, is to use first-party cookies on Safari to store consent. Server-side storage or mobile internal data storage would also suffice. How do publishers integrate with the transparency and consent framework? So publishers will display this consent UI on their web pages to reach the consumers. The CMPs provide this. The consent preferences are collected from the user. Publishers can also function as their own CMP, or they can use this existing registered CMP. And there's a list of CMPs here, which is the link to advertisingconsent.eu. And then publishers can use the framework's ability to have global web-wide consent strings for users, or publishers can have the flexibility to use first-party cookies to store consent. How do buyers and vendors get consent strings? First, register to be a vendor on the global vendor list. Know what your ID is so that when you read consent information, you know which ID you are associated with, and then can act accordingly. The consent information can be read either by pinging the API, the CMP JavaScript API, which is used by on-page JavaScript tags to obtain the consent and vendor list information, or the consent string as it's passed through OpenRTB. So that compressed consent string is one of the parameters in OpenRTB, and you can read that and then determine if you have consent or not, and then take action from there. As a vendor, how do I check for consent? So to look up CMPs, to look up consent from a CMP, and this is taken directly from the implementation guidelines. So if you want to read all through this, it's on the implementation guidelines on the GitHub. So a vendor would make a call to CMP on page called get vendor consents. And then there's also guidance for say frames or post message to proxy these calls. There's also some guidance around failure handling. As a vendor, what do I do with this consent information? The consent information can help determine if user data can be used by you as a vendor. The workflow is as follows. So parse the consent string, know what your ID is, know if you have consent or not. If GDPR does apply, learn what the consent status is, and understand what the gating of the purposes are, and then disable use of user data in your features if there is no consent. Some of the policy details about why to behave this way are available in the advertisingconsent.eu policy documentation. As a buyer, how do I look for consent information? So it could be received server-side through OpenRTB. We showed those fields where you'll be finding the consent information. And then those parameters are going to be passed through bid request. In any non-standard, or also I think pre-bid is already has the appropriate fields to pass this information as well. But you should also clarify with those partners how the consent payload will be passed. If the information is on the client side, read the consent status by leveraging the CMP on page. So in the CMP JavaScript API specs, we have all the calls of how you should be accessing that consent information. As an agency, in case there are any agency folks on the call as well, or if you work with an agency and want to help them prepare and make sure they're integrating correctly, the agency should also be registering on the global vendor list, especially if they're European-based. The registration link is shown here, or advertisingconsent.eu can also redirect you there. Then also understand the capabilities of your DSP partners to ensure you only get personal data when you have a legal basis to handle it. So if that legal basis is consent, this framework can help communicate that consent status to you as an agency. So some of the following questions might be helpful for agencies to ask their DSPs. Are your DSPs working with the transparency and consent framework? Are your DSPs reading consent strings? Are your DSPs communicating consent and passing personal data only when there is a legal basis? If so, how? What does that look like? Can it be audited? So I think it might make sense to answer some of the questions that have come through now. The next section that we have for you all is the future directions, which includes mobile in-app support and pubvendors.json. So I'll answer some of the questions that have come through now, and Andrew, if you can help me do that, that would be great as well. Let's see. All right. So another question was if consent, how do you handle Safari? I think we answered that. How can publishers request their vendors get involved or sign up? I love this question. This is actually something that we have an example email of what a publisher could send to their vendors to get them signed up on the global vendor list. So if you want to see what that example email blurb is, it's in the implementation guidelines, which are on the GitHub in the implementation guidelines document. So that's, I'm so glad that that question was asked because we have that ready. So yes, publishers should be asking their vendors to sign up. How does a CMP work on browsers where no third-party cookies are allowed? So that's the Safari situation, and I do think we answered that. So first-party cookies are also an alternative way of storing the consent information. What about under 18 people? Is that an option? So a publisher could always try to configure the consent interface or have that trigger accordingly. The framework, the handling underage users is slightly outside the scope of the framework itself. So you should check with your legal guidance. Andrew, I don't know if there's anything you want to add about how to handle underage, or if there's any triggers that you have in your CMP.
I mean, we certainly take a very conservative approach to that, and basically say just provide no, like just say no consent if your website's focused. And I think it's 16 and under for GDPR, for people 16 and under for GDPR. Like for websites like targeting those that demographic, it's probably just the safest to basically not install a consent manager and just provide a no consent signal. But that's sort of a case by case basis.
Yeah. There was another question. As an ad tech vendor offering verification or fraud detection products, these folks are receiving conflicting interpretations on how to execute and be compliant by May 25th as a registered vendor. So Lee, you asked that question. I'm happy to follow up with you additionally. But any vendor who's running scripts on page needs to communicate their legal basis for processing that information in a transparent way. So if your partners, and I guess this is applicable for anyone regardless of function, but if your partners are asking for an auditable way to communicate if you have a legal basis, you being any vendor, has a legal basis for processing consumer data, the framework is an excellent way to communicate that. Andrew, would you have any additional thoughts on why people should be registering to the global vendor list?
Like the biggest, it's just the basic reason of GDPR. If you're collecting personal data from European, from people in Europe, and you're pretty much on the web, that's a pretty good reason that you'll want to sign up to be on the vendor list, so that you'll be able to obtain consent through the transparency consent framework.
Awesome. There were a few questions about are the CMPs free to use? And Andrew, you did a good job of answering these on the typed Q&A as well, but maybe we want to just read these out loud so that everyone can glean information from this. Do you want to read one of the answers that you provided, Andrew?
I mean, Quantcast Choice is currently free to use. We basically want to encourage publishers to obtain consent, and we want consent rates to be as high as possible. Other consent managers may charge, and that's certainly an option as well. You have to imagine that the ones that are charging money may offer better support or maintenance. So.
Cool. Someone registered today as a CMP. How long is the process from now, from creation of that registration to when you have a subdomain and when you're listed as a registered vendor or a registered CMP? May 25 is indeed fast approaching. The delay should be within 48 or 72 hours. There is a team that's reviewing those registration requests, and then we'll return that ASAP. Everyone is very aware of all the time sensitivities here. To those on the call, if you are thinking about registering as a CMP or as a global vendor, highly recommend you do that now sooner than later, as there is a delay. Hopefully within 24 hours, but could take 48 hours. So if you register on May 24th, that's cutting it very close. So register now. There's a great question here that I am surprised we actually haven't covered yet, but is consent taken restricted to a particular publisher, or can the CMP take consent for all publishers? The answer is both, and the fundamental principle here is that there's a lot of flexibility. But Andrew, do you want to help provide some color onto how a CMP could take consent for all publishers or take consent for just one publisher? Or not?
Sorry, I'm sitting there speaking to the muted microphone. The global vendor consent cookie is how CMPs sort of share the global consent between publisher websites. A lot of publishers just indicated that they wanted to have consent be specific to their website, and that's why the first party cookie option is available. There's one small advantage for a publisher that doesn't need to request its own data consent for its own data purposes, and is using the global vendor cookie, may not need to show the CMP UI ever. Basically, if a CMP has already gathered global consent on another website, and the publisher doesn't need to collect their consent for their own data purposes, then it's sort of a UI then the publisher can sort of reuse the global vendor consent and not have to pop up the UI. That probably applies to a minority of cases, but it is a small advantage to think about. Did I answer the question?
I think so, and if you didn't,
right,
someone will ask it again.
Right.
Keep them coming, you guys. I don't think we're going to be able to answer every single question in this event, but we've answered a lot of them, which I'm happy about. So if you want to follow up to your question, some of you have your names out there, and so I can connect your name to your email address, but if you've asked a question as anonymous, it's really hard to follow up with you because I literally don't know who you are. So if you want to if you feel comfortable providing your email address, or just type in your name, and I can find out what your email address is based on your registration to this event, and then we can follow up individually. That'd be great. That'd be a great way to go forward answering these questions. All right, so we have about 12 minutes left of the hour, and I think it's super important to go through some of these future directions of the transparency and consent framework, and then we'll try to answer any more questions as they come up. So much awaited mobile in-app support, and then also very critical developments on publisher transparency and controls. So we'll talk about pubvendors.json that solves that as well. Both of these specifications are in public comment till June 1. So if you disagree, think we could do it better, or have feedback, please reach out to us. I'll show the emails that you can reach out to us at the end of the presentation. How do mobile app publishers integrate with the framework? The mobile in-app consent API is a way for vendors to communicate with the app developer or the app itself about the status of consent of users. So it's this global interface within an app that all the partners of the publisher can easily access the consent information. There's obviously still needs to be a consent tool that users interface with to ask for consent. There's some UX and UI considerations for mobile apps specifically. And that many of those can be figured out in your own configuration preferences. how does a CMP fit into the flow of an app? So the flow for integrating is the following, and this is also taken directly from the specification. So if you want to learn more, the specification is posted on the GitHub repository as a draft for public comment. A publisher will embed the CMP SDK and configure it to collect the consent as needed, and the exact setup can be specific to each CMP. The specifications that we've provided is not in and of itself an SDK, but rather code that an SDK provider can use to solve problems or solve this opportunity for the app developers. The CMP will let everyone know that a CMP is present by changing the status of this flag. And then a CMP can then check if GDPR applies and show that consent tool to collect consumer consent. And a publisher has the options to choose the timing of that request to collect consent. And then critically here, the CMP will then be able to set or store the consent information on shared preferences variables as needed. And then all of the vendors can read from that directly. So this is a way for vendors to learn if they have consent or not. The vendors can also listen to the consent string and then change their use of personalized or use of personal data in their ad serving as needed based on that consent. So this is the basic function of how mobile in-app is supported. Further details are available in the spec itself. And I think something that's been critically showing up in our working group is that we are aware that we're slightly late to the game with providing in-app support here, as we'll be finalizing this specification post 2025 in early June. But we do have plenty of people who are already early adopting this. So at this point in time, the call to action to all of you is to communicate. If you're doing in-app inventory, communicate with your partners to make sure that you have a plan to integrate with this, so that everyone can benefit from using a standardized approach to collecting consumer consent on a per vendor basis in accordance with the framework. Let me see if any questions came through on mobile specifically. By the way, yes, this is recorded and we'll have these materials posted. Will the content on mobile in-app be different based on operating system, iOS versus Android? The information, like the policy blurb that shows up on a consent tool shouldn't be different because it's the standardized purposes that are going to show up and same global vendor list. While this person had mentioned the iOS and Android differences, we've actually started building out wrapper code to support implementations of this functionality. It's on the GitHub repository. It's a pull request. We'll merge it shortly. No other questions, mobile specific, coming up. But thanks for listening, and really hope that you'll all be able to implement this in the near future. The other area that's very exciting is pubvendors.json. So this is out for public comment right now. Essentially, publishers had surfaced feedback on the framework that they needed additional support regarding publisher liability and the support of communication of legitimate interest. So pubvendors.json kind of spurred out of those asks for publisher transparency. So the high-level goals of publisher vendors.json is the following. Provides a standard way for publishers to publicly declare the vendors that they are working with and their permissions and configuration. It allows vendors to verify publisher GDPR settings and audit that CMP consent string based on what the publisher's publishers allowed vendors are. It really critically here, it provides a standard way for publishers to whitelist vendors. It also enables publishers to further restrict purposes on a per vendor basis. So a lot going on here. What does it look like? So publishers would implement a file named pubvendors.json at the well-known path of their domain. This is super similar to ads.txt and robots.txt. And in fact, we've just gotten back some feedback that maybe pubvendors should be hosted as a text file rather than a JSON file. So that's something that the working group is talking about. And if you want to help be a contributor on that conversation, join the working group and get involved as we resolve this and move towards finalizing the spec. A publisher should then also use a CMP that supports the use of the publisher vendors file, so that the CMP could read that whitelisted publisher vendor list and make action on it, and then everyone in the ecosystem as well can also learn what the accepted vendors are by that publisher. And this is for all vendors, not just sellers or resellers like ads.txt functions for. More details available in the pubvendors.json proposal, or if you want to become a member of that working group, let us know. I will show you this slide. It's my second to last slide, but this has the email aliases for the project. So if you have feedback about the general functionality of the framework, or about some of the policies, or about things like the global vendor list, or just general feedback, reach out to the feedback@advertisingconsent.eu. And if you have any technical feedback or want to join this technical working group, reach out to us at transparencyframework@iabtechlab.com. You can also email me. I'm the recipient of this alias. I'm at jennifer@iab.com. Let's answer some more questions. Andrew, if you want to help me. If you guys want to ask your questions, we'll be able to answer them. What's the expiry for the consent cookie? So the guidance that we have in the specs is 13 months, I think. Or that's how often consent should be re-asked. Someone asked, when I add the unregistered vendor to a global vendor list, so you're extending the vendor list, it needs to, someone who reads that consent says, if you have a extension use case for a vendor list and you create a consent string and then you write that to the consenty.org domain, yes, there is a problem. We are working on ways to resolve conflicts of writing cookies to a shared cookie space. Again, if you want to be a part of the working group to solve that problem, let us know. We're looking probably at having a central authority help manage that process. More to come on that. Yes, the slides will be available. We'll send out a follow-up email, but if you just check the IAB or IAB, I think IAB.com/GDPR, or email transparency framework at IAB Tech Lab, or IAB website, IAB Tech Lab website as well. Lots of places. In-app is still open for public comments. Do you expect CMP vendors to be able to launch a GA version for mobile apps by 5/25? In fact, some CMPs have already launched functionality, and either they're testing or they're live. Some of the very active participants in the mobile subgroup include Smato or Didomi, as people I could offhand point to, but there are plenty of others who are working rapidly to getting support, if not by May 25, but by very soon. And I think there are some placeholder implementations as well. We've got 2 minutes left. If anyone posts any further questions that come through, that'd be great. I'll try to respond to as many as possible after this webinar closes. But I want to thank everyone so much for participating in this webinar. Hopefully this was helpful as you all finalize your implementations and get ready in the next week for May 25. I will be thinking of everyone on May 25, and we can all take a breath. but there will still be plenty of work to do together. So thank you for joining this webinar. Andrew, thank you for giving a CMP demo and helping answer some of these questions. And please do reach out if you have any further comments or questions or points of feedback, or if you want to get involved. And thank you so much for those of you who are IAB and IAB Tech Lab members. Andrew, do you have any other closing comments that you want to add here?
No, I'm just trying to answer up some last questions. If you could also have you pointed people to the Slack groups as well, or are those open to the public?
Slack groups are open to the working group members. So if you're IAB Tech Lab member, you can join the GDPR technical working group. We've got really active Slack groups that can help with implementation questions as well. That's open to IAB Tech Lab members who are in the GDPR working groups. Yeah. Awesome. That brings us to the end of our hour together. Thank you everyone so much. We had almost 200 people on the line. I hope you all found value in this. Please reach out if any further questions. Good luck, and we'll be seeing you. Thank you all so much. Thank you, everyone. I think we're going to close the call now. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Jennifer.